everyone, to this Wednesday evening and another edition of Crosstalk. We find ourselves here at the end of June, on Wednesday, June 30, and I find myself alone. I think all the conversation partners have taken off for vacation. So this evening, as we look forward to the 4th of July, I just wanted to share one of the Psalms that's become a favorite of mine over the last few weeks, Psalm 77. This is not a psalm that's specifically addressing our national holiday that's coming up on Monday, but I think it's a great word for Christians who are living in our culture today. So Psalm 77 is 20 verses, and the first 10 verses form a lament, and then there's a transition in verse 10, and then verses 11 through 20 are a hymn. So there are two different literary styles that are combined in this one psalm, and I think there's a real reason for that, and we're going to talk about that in just a few moments. But as we begin, let me just share with you this Psalm 77. I'll read it in its entirety, and I pray that this will be a blessing for you this evening as you reflect during the night hours on God's goodness and God's care for us. So Psalm 77, these are the 20 verses of Psalm 77. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. I remembered you, O God, and I groaned. I mused, and my spirit grew faint. Selah. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart mused, and my spirit inquired. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Selah. Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds. Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. The water saw you, O God. The water saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now, as we began, we said that these first 9 verses are a lament, and there are a great many lament prayers in the Psalms. But this is sort of unique in that this is not necessarily a lament for some sort of personal crisis that the psalmist is facing. This lament is clearly a lament for the nation. It's a lament for God's people, and God's people have found themselves in a situation, in a circumstance, and it just doesn't seem like God is acting on their behalf, nor has God acted on their behalf in the recent past. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. It sounds like perhaps somebody has been watching the latest news network in our own culture, just so concerned and overburdened by the events, rightly so, or overburdened by the events of our current world situation, our current national situation. And this has been an occasion for more than one person to stay up at night. I suspect that this psalm, and many scholars agree, was written during the time of the Babylonian exile. You'll remember that God had saved the little nation of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital in 722 BC when the Assyrian armies came through. Hezekiah was the king during those days, and Isaiah was one of the working prophets. God had protected in a miraculous way Jerusalem in 722, but in 586, 587 BC, the armies of Babylon massed at the gates of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was overthrown. There was a great deal of destruction in the city. Those who had already not been exiled were taken into exile, and just a few people were left there in Jerusalem, just a few of the Jewish people. The bulk of the people were taken away into Babylon. On Sunday evening, we've been studying a very familiar cycle in the Old Testament. It really begins in the book of Judges. We find that the people of Israel, God's people, want to be like their neighbors, and they think their neighbors have a great life. And so inevitably, when we want what our neighbors have, our neighbors come in and take us captive. And then, of course, in the book of Judges, the people would cry out and God would send a deliverer. And for a little while, the people would be okay until they wanted to be like their neighbors again. And so I think the people of Judah had wanted to be like the Babylonians. The kings invited them in, showed them the royal treasury. Come on, let's look and see what we have. Thinking that the Babylonians will be impressed, but rather it just whetted their appetite to come in and to take the land. And so we see this terrible fate overcoming Jerusalem and overcoming the nation of Judah. The people, of course, are taken into exile, where they will be like their neighbors. They will be assimilated into Babylonian culture, and the very great possibility is that there will be no more Judah, no more Israel, no more people of God. They'll just be like the rest of the nations. And we get those laments other places in the Psalms. For instance, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. So here's a person who doesn't see God at work in the circumstances. And then in verse 5, he says, I thought about the former days of years long ago. I remember my songs at night. My heart mused and my spirit inquired, will the Lord reject us forever? And clearly this person is sort of reflecting back on the more recent past, before 586, before 587. Days of good days in the land of Judah, good days in the land of Israel, when it seemed like God was, in fact, blessing the people. And so as we think about those former times, sometimes our anxiety even grows. I believe many people, perhaps in our own culture and in our own nation, are feeling this way. We feel like our culture is so rapidly shifted. I know at least I do. I go out and I hear what people are saying. I hear from the media some of the thought processes that are being forecast around us, and I just feel like, where am I living? In the last 25 or 30 years, our nation has had a seismic shift in culture and in thinking, and it is definitely a shift away from Judeo-Christian values, a shift away from traditional norms and practices into something that is very unfamiliar and sometimes not very attractive. So we wonder what has happened. Church isn't like it used to be. Our work isn't like it used to be. Our neighborhoods are not like they used to be. And we wonder, where is God? And then in verse 10 it says, "Then I thought, to this will I appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High." Weiser, in his commentary on the Psalms, retranslates that a little bit and believes the Hebrews suggest that this is the illness to which I appeal. It's the years of the right hand of the Most High. In other words, he was saying that his illness was that he was trying to predict what God had done in the past and now trying to look for that same providential care in the future. And I think that's what many of us do. We look at what God has done in the past, his providential care in the past, and we want to project that out into the future, and it just doesn't seem like anything corresponds. And all we can do is think, well, we're out of control. God's not listening to our prayers. God's not doing anything. And so again, we lay awake at night with our eyelids open, looking at the ceiling. But after verse 10, here's the transformation from a lament to a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. "I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds." Again, we find in the Hebrew translation a little bit of variation. There's something that is called the spoken, the kere, or there's something that's written, and that's the ketib. And the scribes would write the ketib, but they would know to pronounce the kere. And in this particular psalm, it says, I will proclaim your works, and I will recount your mighty deeds. And so we find ourselves, when we begin to look at the written, that this seems to be a setting within the assembly, the people of God. In other words, this person went to church, even in Babylon. And then in church, in the assembly of God's people there in Babylon, the ones who were not assimilating into Babylonian culture, the ones who lamented the loss of nations, the ones who lamented the loss of their identity, began to worship and recount what God had done. The praise continues in verse 13. "Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great as our God?" Isn't that a wonderful expression of faith and trust and confidence? I think of some of the great hymns that we sing in church. "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing." And remembering that Martin Luther wrote that in the midst of the Protestant Reformation, his life literally on the line as he was being threatened by his enemies, threatened with death, still trusting in the mighty God of Israel and the mighty God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples, the psalmist says. And then the psalmist goes to recount a particular episode, and this is the formative episode in Israel's history. This is why there is a Hebrew people. This is why there is an Israel. This is why there was a Judah. It was an act of God. It was not something that Moses did. It was not something that Aaron did. They had no authority. They had no resources to free the Hebrew people from Egyptian bondage. This is solely God's initiative and God's work. And then we get this incredibly poetic exposition of the crossing of the Red Sea, the Passover, the night that the lambs were slain, and then the crossing of the Red Sea to Sinai. And there at Sinai, the reception of the law and God providing for his people in the desert. "The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. Clouds poured down water, and the skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world, and the earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters." And so you can imagine that experience of the people of Israel going through the Red Sea with the waters divided on either side, and the Egyptians in hot pursuit, and then the waters closing back and forth, and the people being led, we'll remember, by the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and that was going before them through the sea. And this was an incredibly dramatic rescue. This was an incredibly dramatic show of God's power and God's strength that, again, formed the nation in the first place. And so there's this celebration within the assembly. This is who we are. This is why we're here. This is why we're even here brokenhearted over the turn of events for our people. Brokenhearted for the exile, brokenhearted for the loss of identity, all of these things. As they remember their brokenness, they remember God's mighty power that called them into being in the first place. And then, of course, all of this conversation about lightning and the whirlwind, recounting Sinai, the giving of the law, the trembling mountain, as God made a covenant with his people. And so it's this covenant that redeems God's people, even in the midst of exile. And then I think the punchline for me in this psalm comes in verse 19. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. God's providential care is moving on even when we do not see God at work. I imagine the Egyptians probably had all kinds of explanations for the destruction of their army. We might imagine the propaganda machine going to work on the next day trying to explain wind and waves and tides and currents and all this kind of thing, and blaming some generals as well as Pharaoh on miscalculations, trying to explain away the event. And obviously, even the Hebrew people, as they went through the waters and got on the other side, were not fully aware of what was happening. They began to grumble. Moses, why have you done this, Moses? They said. God's ways are often hidden, and unless we are looking for them, and sometimes only in retrospect, we look back and go, oh, it was God that parted the waters, although his footprints were not seen. Invisible ways of God's work. Now, I think this must have brought great confidence to these exiles in Babylon who wondered, where is God? Well, God is at work even if we don't see God at work. And God is at work working to redeem. God is at work working to judge the Egyptians and judge that which is evil. God is at work, even though we don't see his providential care at the moment. We will see it revealed at a future time. So that must have stilled the will and given great hope to those exiles in Babylon. God's hidden and unforeseen ways and God's surprising ways. 586, 587, a great disaster for the little nation of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. But as we open the pages of history and further go down through the prophetic books, we find that in 538, not too many years later, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Medes and to the Persians. In the book of Daniel, you'll remember Belshazzar throwing his feast, celebrating his invincible empire. And then, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, you are weighed in the balances, and you are found wanting. It was that night that the Persians marched into Babylon, took over the city and took over the government, and Cyrus, the Persian, was now the king of that great empire, and the king that would hold the fate of Judah in his hands. As we read the text, we're also reminded, the prophets tell us, the historians tell us, that Cyrus sent many of the exiles back into Jerusalem to rebuild the Jewish temple there. Cyrus was intent on reestablishing the people of God in their land. This pagan leader, this pagan emperor, was used by God, even so much so that Isaiah, looking into the future, said that he's God's anointed. He's going to do something for God and God's people, even though he may not even realize he's doing that, because the footprints of God are not always seen on the bottom of the sea. And so God did act to deliver his people in a surprising and shocking way. Well, as I look at our national landscape, my heart is broken. As I said, I'm sure many of your hearts are broken. But I do believe in God's providential care. And I do believe that God is still on the throne. And I do believe that God is still on the move. And he's calling us perhaps to sing a hymn, not just to sing laments. And we are sorry for all the brokenness around us, and we do lament that. But I think this is a time to sing a hymn of celebration of our mighty God, who is going to work on behalf of his people. After all, while the Hebrew people could look back on the Exodus experience as God's great deliverance, you and I can look back at the cross of Calvary, where Jesus Christ died. And for that time on Friday, all of his friends felt like they had failed, God had gone away. But during that time when his disciples had deserted him, on that Good Friday, Jesus Christ was taking the sin of the world upon himself to free us from the burden and guilt and punishment that comes with sin. And on that Good Friday, Jesus Christ defeated the powers of evil in this world. And then, of course, on the third day, on that first day of the week, the day of resurrection, Jesus Christ was vindicated. No one saw him come out of that tomb. Now, his followers would meet him early in the morning. They would experience his presence, and they would touch his resurrection body. And he would teach them for 40 days about the kingdom of God. And he would give them their marching orders. But so much of that episode that goes from Good Friday to the resurrection of the first day of the week is hidden to us. We don't see it. And I believe that God is still at work saving souls. I believe God is still at work changing hearts. I believe the hand of the king is still in God's hands, whether the king knows it or not. And I believe that in the end, God will redeem and bless his people. Now that makes it possible for me to put my head on the pillow tonight, and instead of a lament, instead of staring at the ceiling, it makes me able to praise God and thank him for the provision of this day, and to believe that his hand is not short in these days. It also makes me want to turn my ear and say, God, do you have a little piece for me in this? Do you want to use me and the blessing for at least my family? A word of encouragement, a word of hope? Do you want to use me in my community, to those close by? I want, Lord, to be a part of your work, following you, even though I don't see the footprints. I see the direction in which you're moving. And I believe, oh Lord, that you are good, that you are mighty, and that you have an answer for our world. Well, that's Psalm 77, and I pray that you'll be able to sit down tonight and perhaps read these verses again and take great comfort in the record of what God has done, not just spiritually, although there's a great spiritual battle going on, but what God has done in history, what God has done in time, what God does in the life of people like you and me. I pray that you'll take some time to look at Psalm 77 and be encouraged by it. Thank you for joining me this Wednesday evening for Crosstalk. I look forward next week to finding some of those people coming back from vacation so we can have another conversation, celebrating God's goodness, talking about life in our church, and just meeting some really fun friends, maybe for the first time, or maybe getting to know them just a little bit better. So look forward to seeing you next week on Crosstalk. Thank you for joining me. Good night.